All right, folks, if we could get settled, please, so that we can start up again. What?
I'm ready with you, Mark.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm waiting for people to sit down. I see the tide of people coming in to sit down. So now that Bob is at the rear of the room, and my speaker leaves. Oh, okay.
I went to get some water. Is that okay?
Well, if you had only asked, Bob, we have water here. 10 feet in front of you. But okay, so there are sandwiches left. Grab some at the break if you want to, don't have sugar, have another sandwich. And also there'll be more drinking things available as well, non-alcoholic, unfortunately, yet. Okay, so we're going to get started. We will end on time, this BIB tradition. We're going to keep to it. So I want to introduce Bob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So I'm Bob Glushko. I'm a professor at the Information School at the University of California, across the bridge. This is a follow-up from a talk I gave last year at B&B. I had just published a print, an ebook with some novel ideas about content architecture and how to organize it. Now we have some real experience with teaching from and having students learn from these books, and we're running into all sorts of interesting new problems. The title of the talk is Creating the Multivalent Book, and I have no idea what that means because Peter made it up. He said, "We want to talk again?" I said, "Sure." And he put the title in the paper in the program, and I hadn't gotten around to write an abstract. And I said, "Oh my God, I have no idea what that means." But I've decided that in the spirit of this conference, where we all learn from each other, I'm going to make up some new titles. In fact, based on what I learned this morning, because there are so many cool words I don't understand as well as multivalent that I'm going to put them in my title. So I'm going to start with that. I think what I'm doing today is called an avant-garde rumination on negative space and skimming, grokking, mastering the multivalent book. Because my talk today is really about presenting readers with views of a book that differ in detail. And if you think of the main body of the book as its primary space and supplemental content around the book as the negative space of that primary content, then I'm definitely doing negative space, rumination, and visualization. So there. Okay. Seriously, the talk I gave last year was also mistitled. It was called Collaborative Authoring, Use, and Maintenance of a Multidisciplinary Textbook. And in fact, it was a transdisciplinary textbook, meaning there was a center which was synthetic that was transdisciplinary, and then there were things around it, which is the multidisciplinary parts. I now understand that. And that's what the whole challenge is about this book, which is that it was published last May by MIT Press, simultaneously in print and ebook formats. I used O'Reilly's Atlas single-source publishing platform to do that. I was the first non-O'Reilly author to use Atlas, and we both learned a lot from that. I told the story of this book last year, and the interesting part of the story is that because I teach at this crazy school at Berkeley called the Information School, which has been characterized as halfway between computer science and library science and business, right, halfway between three things is interesting, or as a 21st century library school, or as some kind of intersection or confluence or synthesis of multiple disciplines, I'd always say, well, what exactly is that confluence or intersection or synthesis? And they say, some of this, some of that, some of this. I said, that's a union, not an intersection. What is the thing we're trying to do here in this information school? Synthesize these different disciplines, define it. And they say, just do it. So they handed me the first day I taught this class a computer science textbook and a library science textbook, and I said, that's the textbooks for this class? 2 different textbooks that are totally different? They said, well, the students will figure it out. And I said, that's not right. So I said I set up to write a textbook which would be actually define explicitly that intersection of those different disciplines that were trying to come together at a school like this. I decided that it was a book about organizing, that we taught organizing. And the book is called The Discipline of Organizing, and it says that what these disciplines all have in common is that they organize collections of resources and build interactions on them. And that definition fits your closet, your kitchen, your library, your bank, your data warehouse, your whatever. I mean, they're all organizing systems that organize resources and all that. But when you have a goal like that, something bad happens. People go, this is interesting, let me help. And people would want to read chapters and contribute to chapters. They'd all say, I'm a computer scientist, this is great, but you need to have the following things in this book to be credible to computer scientists. And library science people say, this is great, but you got to have these canonical articles or it won't be credible to library scientists. And so over time, the book was getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it reached about 800 pages. And I realized that was never going to be a book that anyone would ever want to read. So how does a book be both broad enough to represent all the disciplines that contribute to it and deep enough to be credible to any one of those disciplines and still be a readable book? So that was the problem I set out to solve about 2 years ago. And what I did was what I talked about last year. What I did was I did this. I said, maybe there's a core book hiding in there that really is that transdisciplinary core, that really is this new thing that we're talking about, the discipline of organizing. And then there's a bunch of other stuff, which is the disciplinary takes on that are specialization, explaining it from the words from that context for that discipline. Maybe the vocabulary that I've generalized, what the word is used in that discipline. So a librarian says that they acquire things, a museum accesses them, an archive ingests them, a database integrates them. So those are all adding things to collections. And so we'd have to sort of explain the kind of new vocabulary in the context of the old vocabulary and so on. So what we're trying to do was to separate this kind of discipline-specific content from this core content in order to let people focus on the core, namely get the essence of my message and make this breadth and depth thing a choice rather than a distraction or an inevitable confusion. And so we tagged 1/4 of the book by discipline, saying that this paragraph was intended for computer science, or this paragraph is intended for library science, and so on, and tried to use that as a signal to readers whether they could read this book or not. So you can think of this as factoring this book from this one gigantic blob of text into this kind of layered book where it has a core in the center of the book, kind of non-core content that has to be in the chapter to make the chapter work. And then you have all these notes that are on the outside of the book that are the end notes that are tagged by discipline. Now, I'm lying here. It wasn't really that easy because we didn't write it that way. If we'd written it that way, it would have been nice to say, let's have an authoring platform that lets us collaboratively author this book where we mark the text from the beginning as core or disciplinary specific and somehow capture the conceptual dependency of the content as we're writing it, so that if you need to have a concept explained before examples make sense, then you would know that you wouldn't put the examples until the concept was explained and so on. But we were doing this after the fact, so it was an awful lot of chainsawing and surgery and fixing things after the fact to make the book read coherently after we had done this refactoring. Now, I think we know how to do that better than in the future, and I will at some point get to those authoring tools, but that's not what we're doing yet. So what we have now is a book that looks like this, where there's a core plus all these layers of content around it and different notes. And so in the print book, it looks like a law review with so many notes, but they're all tagged by discipline. Like here you see computing, cog, sci, LIS. In the various ebooks, you see things like the tag will say, here's 49 web, and you pop it up, you see the web pop up and so on. And so now we're talking about multivalence. So if multivalent, I think, means more than one having combining power, so we want to be able to have, this book is capable of multiple combinations, and that was enabled by this kind of disciplinary tagging where you say there's a family of related books with different versions produced by different design time configurations. Now, that's not a new idea. We do this in cars all the time. We have an automotive assembly line which can build lots of different models of the same overall make, by customizing which options you pick and so on. We've done this in software engineering a long time by building software product line thinking, where you have some set of modules, you can assemble them in different configurations. There's obviously dependencies. You can't get any package of options with any other package of options in your car and so on. And there's a huge amount of science here that I'm starting to learn about or relearn. We used to do if-def conditional compilation when we build code based on what's this target application and so on. We know a lot that refactoring is harder than building modularly from the ground up. I know that now better than I ever did. You can build to take on plugins. So there's all these architectural principles which I'm trying to rediscover for books, I think. There's also a fascinating analogy in even in book publishing, where elementary school teachers have for years been struggling with the problem of how different students with different skill levels can have the same story without having the same books. And so you can have skills-appropriate readers. There's a whole library called Reading A to Z that has lots of different level versions of the books where they're using these variables like word count or vocabulary length or ratio of high to low frequency words and so on. And they change the structure of the book so that kids can read the same story about the animals in the barnyard, but have read it with very different books. So they can have a discourse in the classroom about the content and yet have read different books that are appropriate to their skills level. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. We have these 11 types of content tags now around the core of this book, ranging from computer science to law. You can imagine something like the Google Books effort has legal annotation, computer science annotation, library science annotation, because again, it has these different points of view on it. And so we want to basically publish different editions that have different combinations of those tags in them. So I went to O'Reilly for the second editions this summer, and we published 2 editions called The Core Concepts, which has no notes and a bunch of simpler examples and quizzes in it. And we have everything in the professional version except for the student quizzes, and that's called the Professional Edition. And they represent 2 endpoints of this kind of customization continuum. We did this with the XSLT script filtering from the XML docbook when we did the assembling books from the docbook XML. So we have audience and user level attributes which are used to filter. Easy problem to do at design time. But we thought about this, that there's 11 kinds of tags, and we can take them in any combination. So what's 11 things taken any number of it at a time? It's a very large number. And even if we tried to be reasonable and say, well, which things kind of go together, we could generate lots of possible editions, like the Memory Institution edition, which would have library science and museums and archives, or the information architecture one, and so on and so on. So we said we can't build them all. O'Reilly wouldn't let us build them all anyway. If we wanted, it's not going to publish 80 books of the same book. So we said we got to solve this problem differently. It's got to be not done at design time. It's got to be done at runtime. For example, this is a possible configuration that a library school might like better than the whole book, perhaps. It also assumes too much homogeneity. Even a place like Berkeley, where we have students coming with lots of different backgrounds, people aren't going to want to read the same things. Even in my course, which has a certain point of view, different chapters will have different multidisciplinary mixes implied. A chapter on resource description will have a lot of philosophy in it about Plato and Wittgenstein and so on, and a chapter on notation will be a lot of computer science. So there's that inherent differences between chapters in their mix. And even the same student may find reading the same chapter over the course of a reading session the need to change its mix based on I'm running out of time to get through this chapter before I have to go to sleep tomorrow or something. So we want to find ways to do it at runtime. So we're now experimenting with a modified book building process which converts our XML source files to class attributes in the EPUB HTML, so we can use JavaScript to do some selective inclusion and exclusion of content at runtime. I'm going to show you some examples of how we're doing that. But it's a deep question because the conventional mechanisms for dealing with books content have always said, well, you have links that you go get extra stuff in, but you don't know how big that extra stuff is at that point. It could be, it could be a very, very large amount of stuff relative to the size of what you're trying to read, or it could be trivially small, in which case you wouldn't care about it. So again, what's the right default? Should you include by default everything, or should you exclude by default everything? And how do you let the reader make those choices? So that's the space we're not working on as a research question. Again, my decision to read extra stuff is dependent on how much there is relative to what I've got in front of me. And what's the disciplinary mix of that supplemental content? And even what's the context in which I'm encountering it right now? What have I just read? So I want to let the reader make all these decisions rather than me as the author or publisher. For example, here is the analysis of the endnotes in chapter 4 of this book. There are 63 notes in this chapter, 16 from computing, 17 from library science, 1 from law, 8 from business, and so on. So from a numerical standpoint, there's more notes from library science and computing than anything else. But from a content standpoint, the longest notes are the ones from cognitive science and business. They tend to be more explanatory rather than just citing references and giving definitions or something. So we're looking at ways to indicate that proportionality about what's going on in that negative space around the core book here. Here you see one of the things we're testing is this kind of tile thing where this shows the 11 chapters of the book and says, what proportion of the extra content in this book is in this chapter? So this says 4 is a highly annotated chapter. You may want to know more about chapter 4 because it's clearly got something interesting going on there. So let's go and choose that. And now we explore that, now see, well, what's going on in chapter 4's note space. And now we see that there's this newer tile that has the breakdown across the types of notes now in that chapter. And so I then can say, okay, it looks like I should learn that library science stuff. Let me select it and then pull the library science notes into the book. So now I have the rest of chapter 4 will have library science notes embedded in the text as I read it. Okay. So, and it shows that checkbox that that's the one which is now embedded. So I have a way to check and deselect. I could go back and say, no, get rid of them and check computer science. And it would change the mixture right then and there in the book as I'm reading it. So now I'm reading the book and I see these notes that says, there's LIS stuff that's been brought into the book right here. This shows that it's been brought in. And so this is kind of the opposite of the usual marker. Usual markers are saying there's something to follow here. This is now by definition meaning there's something that you could take away here. Again, I hope readers can not lose track of what mode they're in. We can do that by having some shading or something like that, but you'll see. So here we say, okay, let's see what the scope of that note is. This is what that library science content was. You know what? Get rid of it. Okay? And we could use something like a bar. We look at other mechanisms. I'm intrigued by Sanders' invisible ink. I can imagine some interesting uses of invisible ink in this kind of situation, showing me where things might be if you want to explore them. And is there anything else here, or maybe a little white space and stuff to show some of that stuff. So again, we are just beginning to explore this, but this whole problem of having a reader configurable book, I think is a really important one because so many ebooks don't take advantage of the E. They're just, books. And I've been trying to find ways to push that experience to let the reader have much more control about the nature of the experience, the nature of the content, nature of the interaction with that content. And so I could, in fact, I'm going to make it go back. I could even try note by note. You can imagine just doing that. And we've done some experiments with hypothesis, trying to annotate at the same time. And you can imagine that maybe you would maybe make a note about why you decided to go there or not go there for other readers in your class, for example. So the story I'm trying to tell is about how this kind of book, which is multidisciplinary, could balance these fundamentally competing goals of being broad enough to be credible and deep enough to be credible at the same time, by marking the text with some kind of attributes like audience or complexity or other things. We have some preliminary work trying to mark up text by rhetorical intent. Like, is this an example, or is it contrastive, or is it counterexample? And that's a little bit too weird yet, but I think there's a possibility there. If done correctly, you have this kind of mother of all books in one place. And so I have resisted approaches that say, let's fork the source code and have different versions of the books. I want to filter the book rather than forking, because I think that if you filter rather than fork, it makes the author pay more attention on things like continuity. Whereas if you say there's two separate bodies of the book, you no longer have that stake making that one make sense, because that's not your book anymore. That's somebody else's problem. So by having authors work together in a collaborative thing where you're going to say, we're going to filter, so every book you read will be a subset of this mother of all books, I think you work harder at making the book make sense in any configuration. I believe that with appropriate user interface controls, readers will be able to optimize the reading experience through some combination of inclusion and exclusion, and maybe next year I'll know what that means. Thank you.